Hi, Mark, and today I have to talk about Brexit again. What a surprise. One topic in the comments is often the real costs of Brexit, and today I want to talk about how much we know so far. And there are quite some arguments about that topic. Since the decision to leave the EU, economists have been trying to quantify the economic consequences. A scientist has now used a model to simulate how Great Britain would have developed without Brexit. But two developments are puzzling the experts. Graham Gudgeon concedes that there's broad agreement, but my point of view is exactly the opposite, says the economist from the Centre for Business Research at the University of Cambridge, summing up his assessment of the economic consequences of Brexit. While there is no evidence that leaving the EU helped, but it didn't do any harm either, he says. Julian Jessup sees it that way too. There is a lot going on in the assessment. The economist from the Institute for Economic Affairs refers to the development of the currency as an example. A connection is commonly made between the depreciation of the pound and Brexit, but external imbalances would indicate that sterling was significantly overvalued at the time of the referendum 7 years ago and would have depreciated sooner or later anyway. Almost 7 years after the Brexit referendum, the struggle continues to assess the economic consequences of the move. There is a broad consensus among economists that the move has cost the British economy, slowed the growth, and made the country more vulnerable to external shocks. The Bank of England shares this assessment, as does the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, an independent government agency that assesses the economic situation, and the country's business associations are in there as well. But there are not only a small handful different opinions. The immediate extent of the consequence of Brexit is also disputed. A large number of additional influencing factors make the assessment difficult. The pandemic, bottlenecks in the supply chains, the energy crisis, and the Russian war of aggression are just the most important of these developments. They are often cited by ministers in Westminster to make it clear how complex the assessment of Brexit is, or to deny it. That's when they use it. The consideration is made even more difficult by the fact that this is about lost growth. Even if the economy were growing, it might have developed better under different conditions. And a corresponding benchmark is missing there. With the help of economic models, John Springford of the Centre for European Reform has therefore developed a so-called double economics, a model to depict how Britain would be doing economically today if the country had stayed in the European Union. He uses 22 developed economies and incorporates their development with different weightings in order to model the fictitious Great Britain. His most recent result from the end of 22 is the actual gross domestic product is 5.5% lower than that of its double, that means the alternative situation within the EU, and thus significantly higher than the 4% that the BOE and the OBR set. Investment fell 11% short of what was possible, trade in goods by 7%. But trade in services is no different. What sounds like dry figures, statistical methods, and mathematical expertise nevertheless causes tempers to boil over, even among economists. It's just a statistical artifact with no meaning, is what Gudgeon taunts his colleague. And Australia and New Zealand traditionally have significantly higher growth rates. The Greek economy would be not comparable to the British economy, is what he said in mid-March at a discussion round of the think tank UK in a Changing Europe in London. Nevertheless, they would be included in the model. Such a thought experiment can never be 100% correct, admits Springford. A comparison with a single state, as Gudgeon and Jessup refer to Germany and France, works even worse. The structural differences between individual national economies are far too pronounced. Springford says his model avoids cherry-picking data and works better than many critics' methods. In any case, the trend is more important than the exact numbers. Great Britain has slipped down significantly from its place in the middle of the developed economies. The indicator used often plays a role in the differences. And if you use the gross domestic product of the USA for comparison, where stimulus packages have stimulated growth, Germany and Japan would also show supposed Brexit effects as growth has weakened since 2018. That's the argument of Gudgeon. However, a completely different impression arises when currency effects are taken into account and economic output per capita, and thus the prosperity of the individual is. And if you measure this, that was said by Sophie Hale, the chief economist at the Resolution Foundation. The observation period also plays an important role. Between the financial crisis and the decision in favor of Brexit in 2016, investments in the country increased significantly. And since the referendum, it has moved sideways at best. Gudgeon and Jessup choose a much longer period of 20 years. It includes the severe slump after the financial crisis and comes to the conclusion that investments are moving along the trend line. Exports of goods have since returned to pre-pandemic levels, is what Gudgeon said. Foreign trade with the EU will feel the consequence of Brexit particularly clearly because of the additional administrative effort. But volume today could be 7% higher or £50 billion in the quarter if the UK economy had grown like this double. And to put it plainly, trade development has been lousy. That was said by Jonathan Portes, a professor at King's College. And the best explanation for this is Brexit. On the other hand, exports of services have remained stable. The share of foreign trade with the EU in total trade has also hardly changed. These are two puzzling developments that we need to look at more closely, says Hale. One possible cause is quite succinct. The quality of the data for services is considered insufficient. Despite the fundamental differences in the assessments of the exit from the EU, the economists agree on a few points. Brexit has exposed and exacerbated the weaknesses of the UK economy. Low productivity, low investment, declining competitiveness, and perhaps most notably, the government's lack of a strategy to tackle these problems. That was said by Anton Spisak of the Institute for Global Change. Gudgeon doesn't see it any differently, and structural issues and weak growth are the real problems in the British economy. But even if they can only agree on these small points, I brought them all up to show one thing. Of course, what we all talk about, all models and statistics depend on what base you put them on. And there's a lot of room for manipulation. But there was one thing wrong in what they said. The trade in goods is not completely back at pre-pandemic level. I gave you recent numbers recently. And the trade in services, there is another point they completely forgot in the discussion. We are still in some places in some transition periods within the TCA, the Comprehensive Trade Agreement that the EU and the UK agreed on after a long negotiating time. They are still running transition periods. Plus, what they already admitted that there are insufficient data on services in some places. But they are still transition periods, and we will see changes in services as well. But you can decide, like always, what you want to believe. But if you look at reality, especially after the pandemic, how other countries in continental Europe came out of the pandemic, and how the UK came out of the pandemic. I said in many videos, it's hard to separate Brexit from pandemic, war in Ukraine, etc. But there is a clear sign in all of these developments that Brexit was not good for the UK. And that will remain. And we saw, and this is just the economic part I'm talking about today. We saw it on the other places. I'm just saying Dover. You probably saw my video yesterday. There are so many downsides of Brexit, And nobody, except the ones that are lying about it because they are talking about things the UK could have done while they were a member of the EU, nobody has shown me a proper benefit of Brexit to date. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.